A recommended way, instead of using a very colorful sort of map which you use to show already things on it, might be easier to take like a map which is minimal in the use of color. It could be light map, it could be a dark map, and the reason is that then this map can work really good as a background, so that you could put data on top of it on the foreground, and that data could then be more visually like evident and stand out, right? And you could use the basics of Gestalt to say that the map will feel as one entity and the data will feel like one entity, instead of it getting confused together, which might have happened if we would have visualized the same sort of circles or something else on top of the previous map, right? So whenever we're thinking about GeoVis, we want to first start with a base map, which is our context, and then think about the data. What form is the data in? Is a vector, a raster, what we will show onto the visualization as well. Now let's look at some techniques, right? The first technique is that the map itself has an element that visualizes data in it, right? This is a fairly tricky and mostly subtle method. You would either see it like this, which is your typical traffic map, right? And this is a map that I made for Delhi. We were trying to figure out if our traffic data is accurate or not. So we got some aggregated data of traffic for Delhi, and then every road is basically shown as a line, but then the traffic level is also shown on the same line. So you start to see a visualization happening on a layer of the map, in this case the road itself, right? And we use color or different hues to show high traffic, low traffic, something that is very obvious to everyone because now we use Google Maps for navigation, right? But something that might not be as evident. And so if you look at Google Maps, you may have noticed that while most of the map is gray to show land, some elements have this yellowish background onto them, right? And what Google Maps does is it tries to highlight areas of interest, or specifically like areas that are popular in a city, by giving it this sort of a shade. This keeps changing, so in different versions of Google Maps you'll see slightly different treatment, but there is always this focus on trying to highlight which part of a city is slightly more popular. And so if you're in a completely new city and you want to at least see where are more interesting shops, places to eat, etc., just using this and nothing else, just the background color of the map, can help you identify that, oh, this is Connaught Place, this is definitely like this central popular area in Delhi. It goes all the way till Janpat, so a lot of shopping here, and then there are some other patches here and in the north which also are popular for food, etc., right? And so suddenly now they're using this element of visualization inside a map to really differentiate between an area that is not popular versus an area that is popular, right? So this two are examples of just using maps or a layer of a map as visualization. However, this becomes fairly complex to pull off, right? You need to have access to the layers of map. It's also very subtle. For a lot of people who've seen Google Maps, they may not have noticed that this sort of coloring exists already. So it works when you are making a general purpose map, but you want to maybe bring in some element of traffic or some other information. The obvious next method to visualize data on top of a map is to put dots on a map, right? And this is one of the most common, easiest to get started with, and has a lot of flexibility as well. This is what it looks like. So you take a base map. In this case, let me take map of Bangalore. Taken like this nice minimal blue map that I've made, and then I throw a bunch of dots on a map, and I'm done with my visualization, right? So this is all the bus stops that are marked on OpenStreetMap, and I've put them on Bangalore. So obviously it doesn't look very great. Weird choices of color, but also all opaque circles means there are parts where there are a bunch of circles sort of coming together. Can't really understand if there are 2, 3, 5 stops there. So the obvious next step that I could do is, let's like reduce the opacity of every circle. So instead now I can see some areas there are clusters of bus stops, a lot more bus stops than others, and we can start to see like the network of bus routes, etc., emerge a bit better. I don't have to stop here. I could apply all my visual encoding knowledge by actually giving color as a way to separate out different bus stops. So this could be, say, bus stops that I have accessibility information about versus bus stops that I don't have accessibility information about. Or I could take some quantitative data set, like maybe number of buses that pass through this bus stop, or that stop here or not, right? And so suddenly I'm using size as also a way to visually represent data, and now I can get like really rich visualizations which have a map in their layer. They are using all the visual encoding methods that we have studied, and we can get some interesting sort of dots on a map or graduated proportional symbols, as the proper name exists for these particular work, right? So you've seen this or a version of this, which is basically different ways to visually represent information. Oh, spoiler alert, sorry. But you'll probably get to know this a bit more. But all we are doing is we are taking aspect of data set and then visually representing it by choosing one characteristic. It could be something as simple as color, length, size of a particular shape, maybe shade of the color, darkness, patterns, etc. So a bunch of these, there is a lot of research on this area. There is now enough sort of heuristics that you can use to say, if I have a numerical data set that is discrete in nature, this is the type of visual representation that is best for it. And so I'm going to show you a few examples of this technique of putting dots on a map, right? And we'll go through them and see how they work. Here is the first example. This is a bunch of Americans asked, where is Ukraine on a map? Can you put a dot on it, right? And so every dot is one guess, right? And what they've done in this particular visualization is that they've taken the distance from actual Ukraine to then color the dots, right? So this is, I mean, this is this ongoing joke, meme, whatever, about how Americans don't understand anything beyond their world. Not sure how true it is not, but clearly some Americans thought this is Ukraine. I have no idea what they did in school. And clearly a bunch of them thought Ukraine is up here. But you can start to see that all of these guesses are obviously blue, very far away from the actual place. You can start seeing some people marking Ukraine like over here. Again, I can understand if they don't they don't really understand where Central Asia is or where Asia in general is. But you can see a bunch of people who've gotten it right. That is more red, right? So the accurate ones are red in color, and then there is this subtle gradation from red to blue that's been used to show the distance of the guess or how off they are, right? And so in something like this, it works really well. A dot, it doesn't need to say anything else. It becomes very easy to start noticing. And they've used a bunch of things. They've used a dot for every guess, so the position. They've used color to show how far away from the actual location of Ukraine you are. And then they've also used opacity to basically give you a better understanding of clustering, right? Like there's some area where there are a lot more guesses than others, and so making slightly translucent or transparent circles allows you to see that. Yeah. A more serious use case, here is one map of New York and the neighboring sort of boroughs. And here every dot is one person, and the color of the dot is mapped to the major sort of races that are available in this area. So you have blue for white, green for black or African American, red for Asian, yellow for Hispanic, and then a few other races or maybe natives or multiracial folks, right? And so you can start to see New York, which is considered one of the very racially segregated cities, and you can start to see how that actually is. So for those who aren't aware of New York and have not seen it ever on a map, this area here is New York, right? The white area here is the Central Park, therefore nobody stays there. But you can see that property right on this part, the eastern part of Central Park, is considered one of the really nice luxurious places to stay, right? And so that is all white people staying there. You can see everywhere else there is a good mix of people staying. This area is a lot of offices and downtown Manhattan, some of that area. You can see the small patch of red stand out, which is Chinatown, which has a really huge Asian population, hence red in color. And you can see that in most of this area there is barely any green. So African Americans tend to barely live in the main New York mainland. You can see instead some areas like here where there is a lot of African Americans, somewhere here which is more towards New Jersey, or something here which is down from Brooklyn, there you have a few more people. So you can see neighborhoods that have predominantly one type of race, like a lot of Hispanics here, a lot of Hispanics here and here, whereas a lot of white people here and some areas, right? And it becomes an interesting visual way to represent racial segregation. The only bit that I'll mention here is that a dot isn't super accurate. And they do that obviously because of privacy reason. You don't really want a map that literally tells you where every black person lives, because you don't know what people are doing and what might happen. But in general what they do is they take the block data, which is a small sort of division of land, and they know in this block there are 200 white people, 20 say black people, and for this purpose of map, I think they randomize within the block. So you can see, get a feeling of at a block level how the racial separation is, and this is done by University of Virginia as well. So the data comes from the census block data for this. So let's look at a few more examples. Some of these examples are from Mint, which is a newspaper that I quite like because they had this really nice data team, and they used to do a bunch of collaborations, and when we were at Grameener also collaborated a bit with them. So this is a very nice map because it again has dots for every sort of election constituency, and the circle is representing like every constituency, but the size of the circle shows the swing or the change in vote from one party to another, right? So bigger the circle, the more was a shift of vote share from one party to another in the last sort of Lok Sabha polls, and the color shows in which party's favor did the votes change, right? So there was this whole talk about like there was a Modi wave in 2019 and similarly in like the previous year, and you can see somewhat that happening on this map, because you can see in this North India Hindi belt that people tend to refer to it as, there are a bunch of these orange circles, so votes more in favor of BJP and sized bigger, so there's a fairly like significant swing. Whereas you can see a swing in the favor of Congress, a bit in the eastern states, a bit in Punjab, and then definitely in Kerala and I think Tamil Nadu, right? So those states were the ones where Congress was getting a bit more votes, right? Now this again becomes an interesting technique to visually represent changes that are happening in a particular elections. We can see a lot more of this. So this is a map of America, and it shows jobs either gained or lost every year, and you can see the bar above is cycling through multiple years, and you can see the change happen during the dot-com burst and then essentially impacting a year later, and then again the 2007 recession that is also leading to like a lot of jobs getting lost, right? So you can see by now 2002 a lot of people who reported that they had lost their jobs, and then after 2007 and 8 and 9 you can see a lot of people who reported a loss in jobs, right? And if this would have continued, this is obviously from 2017, you would have seen a similar sort of wave of job losses during COVID, and there's also like a lot of conversation now of a recession sort of upcoming, so there is a bit of job losses happening now as well. So in these two, we could see that there were dots with size to show some quantitative information, and then color was used to show two different variations. You can see the same here, but there's also an element of time and therefore animation or interactivity getting added to it. And we can do a bunch of different things as well. In this case, this is a map of eruptions, earthquakes and emissions. So earthquakes are in this eruptions are in the triangle, red colored. Earthquakes are blue in color, and then emissions, which are these sort of oil gas emissions, are in yellow, and they'll show up in a bit. But in this case again we have a time axis, there's some opacity, there is some size used to represent magnitude, and this is after which they started like recording a lot of emissions across the world, and this again becomes a nice visual way to show information. However, there's only so much that you can do by putting dots on a map, right? And this is a map of potholes in New Jersey, probably very familiar to potholes in Bombay or in Bangalore, right? And this obviously is cheekily done, it's not supposed to be used, but maybe meant just as a way to highlight what's happening. But you could instead use a different technique. One of the techniques is called clustering, where you essentially have individual points, but when you zoom out, you combine those points into one circle. So this is an example of clustering being used, where as you zoom in, every circle breaks into smaller points, but if you zoom out, you see like a big circle that says 200 or 100. So this is, I think, a map of women marches against Trump that we made when Trump got elected, and this was happening all around the world, and you can see it was definitely happening in India. So instead of showing every dot at a zoomed out, so not in India, in America. So at this point, at a zoomed out level, we don't want to highlight every individual dot, so we group them up together to give like a number. And you might have remembered this technique is what I had used for the wisdom and stories map that I had shown, the night sky with yellows, and there was a clustering being used there as well, right? So same technique of clustering being used there as well. Yeah. So this was the first sort of main technique that I'm hoping most of you use, which is dots on a map, also sort of called as graduated proportional symbol map, graduated or proportional symbol map, a bit of variation based on whether you use categorical, actually you have like a bunch of different data types. But all you're doing here is you're putting dots on a map, position driven by map data, and then using visual encoding, color, size, opacity to make things. The other most common like technique that you might also be familiar is called choropleth, often misspelled or mispronounced as chloroplet, but it is choro for some reason, and you can see that this is one of the common map types that you would have seen. All it does is it takes a big area, splits it into a familiar division. So in America we look at every state as one block or one sort of piece of this map, and then colors it based on an aggregated data and put it on a scale, right. So in this case, this is all the trade that is being done with China, which each particular state's percentage of GDP is, right. So you can see some states tend to have a high amount of trade with China as part of their GDP, whereas others probably don't. And you can divide this or subdivide this based on as much level of detail that you have data for. In this case, this is unemployment rate, and the data is now at this sort of census block or a district level, right. So you can actually, no, this is county, I think this is county data, right. So you can see US after state, like in India we have districts, they have counties. So every county has one shape, and then that's filled by the percentage of unemployment rate at a particular year there as well, right. So this becomes choropleth. It's fairly simple. It doesn't require you to have data which is very accurate. So you're aggregating data. Somebody could just collect all the data in a county of unemployment and then make a map of that single county, right. You don't need to know individual locations of each person who reported unemployment, which for a dots on a map you may have to do. And so let's quickly see the variation that you could see. These are maps that I had done for a small hackathon, and we were looking at paddy or rice farming in India, and I'm using these examples to show the variation of what level are you making your choropleth on might tell a very different story. So here is crop area, so amount of area that every state has dedicated to farming paddy or rice. I mean, this paddy farm leads to rice, right. So in this case you can see UP has the highest area in total of paddy farms, and then it is followed by West Bengal, and then you can see a few other states like Telangana and Jharkhand and others sort of coming up. But if you look at it at a district level, which is one level deeper, a very different story emerges, right. And some of the most like some of the districts that have a high amount of area of paddy farming are actually in West Bengal, in Jharkhand and in Telangana, right. So they aren't really in UP, but by the virtue of UP being a fairly big state, it has a bunch of districts that have small areas of paddy farms that all add up to then look like the state level UP is higher, right. And you can see the same sort of pattern when you look at production, which is how much do they sort of create, or the yield, or the amount that they give at the end of the farming, right. So in this case you can see Punjab, UP have fairly high production, West Bengal and Telangana stand out a lot more for their overall production. But then when you zoom in and break this into district level, you can actually see that there is only like one or two districts that have this really high amount of production in Telangana that stand out and probably contribute to high amount of production overall for Telangana, whereas most of UP isn't very great at like producing rice, just that it has a lot of area for rice production, right. And so this is an example where what data or what angle or what sort of lens you're using becomes important, and then at what level of aggregation are you making your choropleth, that also becomes important. And the story could change drastically the more closer you get to like a detailed map, because the more honest or more accurate that will tend to become. And you can see a few more examples where we are trying different things, right. So this is again a set of Mint articles, and in this one on the left you see a color scale that is dark blue to white. So it's a bunch of numbers, and those ranges are shown from dark to low for turnout in voting. Whereas in this chart over here, the second one, you can see a bunch of different hues or different colors being used for a categorical data set. So in this case, what is the largest employer of women in a particular district is what they're using. And so you can see most of the country has cultivators and agricultural labor being the most common thing that women do. but in specific districts that you can see in Punjab, education and health are more prominent. Same in Kerala, education and health are more prominent, and then in some parts of like northwestern UP, you can see some other services are also really common in Lucknow and Bhopal, right? And manufacturing shows up in West Bengal, in Bhubaneswar, Cuttack, some of those areas. So again, we're using a choropleth. We are doing it at a slightly more detailed level, at a district level. We're using colors on the right, and on the left we're using like tints or shades of a single color as well. So there are different color scales that you may want to use, and you can always connect these techniques together. So this is a map of trees in New York, right? And it shows how many trees are there in which area. So it starts off by the whole area and gives you a single number. Then it zooms in, zooms in to a level where you have a single tree, like every tree mapped out in New York, and you can click on it and actually like see the details of which tree it is, how, when was it planted or how old it is, etc. Right? But you can see this is 65,000 in Manhattan, that then breaks into a borough level. And then at 1,800 level you zoom in, and then you see all the 1,800 or whichever number of trees individually shown, right? So this is an example where you can mix multiple techniques, right? Where you're starting with a choropleth, ending with the dots on a map, right? And this is also an effective way to balance how much information you show when. If you remember, for the Washington DC traffic map, I had done a similar thing. So I started with this 3D choropleth, but then I eventually ended up with dots on a map, right? And that became like a good way to balance the data. So choropleths I think are fairly familiar, really popular, easy to do because the shapes are sort of staying constant. However, they don't really work well when the whole shape doesn't uniformly contribute to the data. And we saw that example when you looked at paddy farming, right? Like it looked like UP had huge amount of area, however, it really didn't. It was just a big area that had a lot of small farms, whereas it looked like Telangana gives a high amount of production, however, it was just one district that was leading to high amount of production, right? So in all of those cases, a choropleth fails to give like a very accurate image, and nothing is more common to mislead than election data, right? And so you'll find a lot of people, especially in the US, talk about how land doesn't vote, people do. And this is the reason why in US, fairly big country, but population is very sparse in most of the Midwest, the middle part of US, whereas the coastal regions have high density of population, which somewhat reflects on their electoral college, and they have a slightly more complex way of figuring out elections. But you'll see a lot of need for making, not making choropleths, but making something else. So we'll see two examples. One is that of binning. So instead of making a shape which is of a state, I'll just cut the map into equal pieces, which are small enough. And then for each of those bins, I'll give them a color, the same way as I was giving the color in a choropleth, right? The advantage here is that it will be more uniform, equal sized bins. So slightly less bias, that just because UP is big doesn't mean it looks like it is creating a lot of production. We get like a better grid, and you can see some examples of like a bunch of different data points being shown across, right? You can see some of these are very effective techniques. For example, Germany. So after the World War, Germany split into East Germany and West Germany, and Russia and the USSR basically ruled on the east side, and then the West Germany was split between US, UK, France, the three major powers, right? And this map, which is more recently made in 2010s, talks about how even today the average income, GDP per capita, or just like the amount of agricultural farm size is very different between the East Germany and the West Germany, right? So you can see that East Germany, very socialist, they were far more focused on just farming and agriculture with USSR rule, whereas the one on the west side had a lot more like tech focus, engineering, manufacturing, all of that focus, and you see a stark difference between the two. So to do this, because there is no such thing as East and West Germany per se today, right? So you wouldn't make like a state level map here. Instead, they've just taken a grid, and with just the grid that they're using, the hex sort of grid, you can start to see those patterns very clearly emerge. You can see something similar here for India. So this talks about different parts of India, and so on a grid they are visually representing whether this area had more or less rain compared to say the last decade or two, right? So this is 2010 to 2018 rainfall. They've taken an average and then seen if this deviated from the last 50 years of rainfall, right? And so the more red it is, the more deviation, as in like lack of rain, and the more blue it is, the more rain it is. And if you see this map, it becomes very interesting to start noticing that a lot of area of UP, Bihar have actually had lesser rain in the last sort of 5 to 8 years than in the last 50 years. Whereas surprisingly, areas in Rajasthan and Gujarat have had far more rain, right, which is earlier considered deserts. So a lot of interesting bits about like climate change, and therefore like a change in how sort of rainfall has been falling in the country. Again, in this case, over here you could see like a circular or a hexagonal sort of bins. Over here it's a sort of rectilinear, squarish sort of bin as well, right? And you've made a bin here. Now, a bin is really helpful here because if this was at a state level, it may have hidden some of these stories, right? Like big states like Rajasthan, you could at least see that probably has predominantly high amount of rain, but then you would not see that edge close to Pakistan, which actually has had a deficiency in rain, right? So all of these details get lost if you would have just done a cartogram, a choropleth here. Yeah, so bins take this nice idea of clustering because they are not showing individual data, and then they are also having some element of choropleth, this color. However, with bins, it's slightly hard to actually make them because you need all the individual data, then make a grid, then programmatically generate it. So slightly complex to do, but it yields some interesting results, right?